Hi, after my last video about bike packing gear, a number of people got in touch with me and asked why I don't use a tarp when I'm camping rather than using a lightweight tent. I probably should have said it at the time, but actually I do use tarps from time to time. Like this one here, it's a Mountain Laurels Design Trail Star, and I'm actually quite fond of it. But I thought it might be a good idea to just kind of look at, in general terms, the pros and cons of tarps v tents for lightweight or ultra lightweight bike packing. The market is chock-a-block with really good lightweight tents. Some more expensive than others, obviously, and there's an increasing number of very good tarps and tarp tents, or tent-shaped tarps, if you like, on the market. Most of them from the kind of cottage industry in America, where the kind of, you know, somebody has a sewing machine in his back room and makes very good tarps. But they tend to be quite expensive. You can use obviously a single sheet of nylon as a tarp, and I've tried those in the past and I've never been terribly satisfied with them. And I have to say, while I have a pretty vast experience of using different kinds of lightweight tents over the past 40 or 50 years, mostly for backpacking, my experience in tarps isn't quite as expansive, and I've really only used a couple of kinds of tarps, mostly pyramid shaped ones, like the kind that used to be made by Golite, and this Trail Star, which I'm actually very fond of within certain parameters. I'd also emphasise that I'm talking about tents and tarps for bike packing and not for backpacking, for hiking. And I'll come to one or two of the reasons why I say that in just a minute or so. I'd also emphasise the fact that, you know, what I'm saying here is actually quite personal, and I actually enjoy the camping side of both bike packing and backpacking. I enjoy putting the tent up, choosing a campsite in a nice place, getting organised, having a nice meal at the entrance to the tent, and having a leisurely evening, maybe reading a book or simply just looking at the views and lounging around. I'm not the kind of bike packer who arrives somewhere about 9:30 or 10 o'clock at night, hastily erects a tent or a tarp and goes to sleep right away and is off first thing in the morning. I actually quite like the camping side of things, so I think that has some effect on my own personal choices of tarp or tent as well. Okay, let's start with tarps, and I've generally kind of resisted using tarps, really because my backpacking and bike packing tends to be mostly in Scotland, and in Scotland we have midges, and I can't think of anything worse than lying about for an evening under a tarp, trying to swat midges and stop midges from biting me. It just doesn't appeal to me. I can go into a tent, close the door and keep the midges out, and although it's not ideal, I think it's far preferable to lying in a sheltered place as a tarp provides, and the midges coming in out of the breeze or out of the rain and feasting on me for an evening. So that's the main reason I don't use tarps in Scotland in summertime. I use this Trail Star in the sort of fag end of the summer, when the midges are dying off, and at the fag end of winter, before the midges start. I wouldn't really want to use it in the winter time because it's too drafty, too chilly, and it doesn't really take loads of snow very well, although it is a fairly windproof shelter. So that's my main reason for not really wanting to use tarps in Scotland, particularly in summertime. Now, having said that, you can buy inner tents for tarps or nests, you know, insect-proof nests. But if you do that, it adds extra weight to the tarp, and you may as well just use a lightweight tent. I don't really see the point in changing a tarp to a tent. I suppose the one big advantage, particularly in something like this Trail Star, is that it's very, very roomy, and you know, there's enough room for two people. So one person could carry the fly, the tarp, and another person the inner tent and the pole, for example. So that will work fairly well. But you know, I tend to do my bike packing solo, and you know, for that reason, I think I'd much rather use a tent during the mid-G season rather than a tarp with an inner nest. Also, if it's very windy outside, as it quite often is in Scotland, I find tarps are quite drafty places. I know you can peg them down very, very low all round, and you know, in this particular model here, you know, lower the door right down, but you've always got a bit of a draft in a tarp, and if you don't, actually, you end up with condensation inside it, which is not a great thing either. So I find that they are quite drafty, and it's the main reason I don't use them in winter. While I don't like the idea of lying in a tent all evening, you know, trying to keep off voracious midges or mosquitoes, neither do I like the idea of lying about in a tarp in winter and feeling cold all night, feeling the drafts, and actually having to get into my sleeping bag and lie there all tucked up from, you know, 7 o'clock in the evening. That doesn't really appeal to me. So I find that a tent with an inner tent and a fly sheet tends to be pretty much draft proof, and in that sense is much more comfortable. And I think that brings us to the question of how you carry a tarp or a tent on a bicycle. It's easy enough to, you know, to stuff up the tarp and stick it into a saddlebag, but most of these tarps are designed for use with trekking poles to hold the thing up, and we don't need trekking poles on bikes, so it's a bit of a pain having to carry a pair of trekking poles, as I do with this Trail Star. I know I could search around and find a bit of wood that would do, but you know, that's extra hassle, and I don't always want to camp in the forests where I could find a branch that would maybe you know, take the place of a pole. So I think that's a bit of a bummer, really. Again, you can get tarps that you don't need poles to erect them, but they tend to be tarps that you hang up from trees or hang from a branch or something. And as I've just said, I don't always want to camp in forests or amongst trees. I may want to camp you know, on an open moorland or on a mountainside or whatever, and it's not always convenient to, you know, to find somewhere to hang a single sheet tarp from. So that's a bit of a problem. So what are the good points of tarps? I've talked a fair bit about the disadvantages of tarps over tents. What are the advantages? I think the main one is they're fairly lightweight. This one here is about 570 grams, just, you know, under £1.50, but you still have to carry a couple of poles, and you know, that weight is on top of the tarp weight. But it's still fairly light, particularly one like this where you can easily get two people in it. So that's the first, the main point, I think. There's also a secondary point, which is again, it's how you feel about the outdoors and why you go to the outdoors. And I think there's a general feeling that with a tarp you stay closer to the land. There's more of a sense of connection with the landscape. You can look outside quite easily. You're not sealed off from the great outdoors. You get the scents and the smells of the outdoors coming into a tarp, and I think you feel that bit more connected to the ground, if you like, rather than sealed up inside a lightweight tent. So those are I think the main advantages, and for a lot of people those are very important advantages. So let's turn our attention now to tents, and let's have a look at lightweight tents for bike packing. Okay, let's consider lightweight tents. The one I tend to use in the summer for bike packing trips is this MSR Hubba tent. It weighs about 1.12 kg, which I think is about 2.5 pounds. So it's quite a nice weight. It's got an inner tent that's all mosquito netting, so it keeps the midges off, which is really quite useful. It gives me full protection from the weather. And because I only use it in the summertime, I don't have to worry about it being terribly storm-proof and wind-proof, because it doesn't really get that bad in the summer. But it will stand up to winds pretty well. The important thing about this tent, and why I like it for bike packing, is you can pack the fly sheet and the inner tent separately. It's good to put the fly sheet in a waterproof bag when you put it in your saddle bag, because if it's wet after a night's camping, you don't want to get everything else in the saddle bag wet, so it's good to keep it a wee bit separate. But what I like about this is the poles, when they're collapsed, they collapse down to a reasonable length, a length that means I can get them into my saddle bag on the bike. And quite often I've used tents where the poles are too long for that, and you have to kind of lash them to the crossbar, which is not terribly convenient. So this particular tent, and tents like this, give me full weatherproofness. They give me midgie proofness as well. And there's something I quite like about coming into a tent and closing down the door and having that little area of privacy. I quite like privacy when I'm camping. And now and again when I'm bike packing, I'll use a public campsite, and I can't even think of using a tarp in a public campsite when you can't have any privacy. But in a tent, you just zip down the door, and there you are, ensconced in there in your own little area, which is kind of nice. So there you go. I used the Trail Star outside the midgie season, at the kind of fag end of summer, and at the fag end of winter as it's moving into spring when there's no midges about, and it's absolutely ideal for that. And for the summer I use this MSR Hubba, and in the winter I use my Hilleberg Acto. It's a wee bit more storm proof in this tent, and I've been using it in winter time for years and years and years. At the end of the day, it's entirely up to you whether you prefer to use a tarp tent, or a lightweight tent with a fly sheet. It's very much your own preference. Much depends on how keen you are on the camping side of things. And I like to spend time in the tent. I like to spend time camping. And of course, the other thing is how prepared you are to kind of rough it. Tents are fairly luxurious, tarps less so. But of course the important thing is not the equipment, it's not the gear, it's getting out there and kind of doing it. And I'm sure there's many of you who will choose not to use a tarp or a tent, but may prefer to use one of Scotland's great network of bothies, and therein lies another tale completely.